Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Erasing Shame podcast. I'm your co-host, DJ Chuang, and today I'm talking with Faith Chang, who is the author of a new book, Peace Over Perfection, Enjoying a Good God When You Feel You're Never Enough. Faith, thank you for joining me for a conversation.
Thanks for having me here, DJ. I'm really excited. Looking forward to it.
Well, I'm fascinated by your studies in college. You have a degree in human development, and you currently live in Staten Island, New York. So I'm curious, what do you learn in human development that might be related to shame and perfectionism, as we're talking about that today?
Well, human development, when I explain my major to people, because it's kind of an interdisciplinary major, I say it's a mix of psychology with some biology and some sociology mixed in there together. And it ended up being very helpful for me in writing this book because I had that background in terms of being able to read psychology papers, but also think
Hmm.
more about culturally and more broadly about what may be impacting our perfectionism in a, I wouldn't say I'm not a sociologist, but in a broader sense than just the individual. And so that combined with some of my theological studies that came really handy, I think, to be able to write this book. And I actually even used my undergrad login. It still worked for some of these
Wow.
access to some of these papers. I was like, thank you. I should have written a thank you note in my afterward. I joked to my album alma mater for access to some of those research, 20 years out after graduation, I still was accessing papers via their login. And so anyways, yeah, human development. I think it was really helpful because sometimes I wrote about Christian perfectionism, sometimes I think in Christian circles, because we don't have a wide enough definition or wide enough kind of study about some of these struggles that people may have, then we can tend to make prescriptive uh, ad advice that is not nuanced enough.
Mm. Yeah, and your book is very well crafted and nuanced, and you help us to understand Christian perfectionism. But before we get into that, let's start with the premise that we have here at the podcast. What comes to mind when you hear the word shame?
So when you say that, I think the first thing I think of is actually a personal experience.
Mm,
I remember the first time I realized that I dealt with shame. And that was specifically this is post-grad. I had graduated from undergrad. I was in ministry, working in college ministry, or maybe well, now I'm a little bit confused some about the timeline, but it was in the college, in the setting of that campus ministry at a conference. And I remember a speaker talking about the difference between shame and guilt.
hmm.
And I remember him saying, guilt says you did something wrong, shame says you are something wrong. And and then I remember just listening to that and crying and starting to cry like in
Mm,
the middle of it as he's speaking. So I had to go out. I went to the bathroom and just sat down and I just started crying. I started weeping
wow.
because I realized how deep this sense of shame that I had was that there was just something fundamentally wrong with me, specifically as a Christian, specifically as someone who is supposedly a daughter of God. And in that moment of recognition, at the same time weeping over it, I think God actually also had by the Spirit was doing this work of healing in me that lifted it in a way that, of course, there was still a struggle with it afterwards, but in a way that really was definitive, like a knocked like a blow to that in my life. I think even just being able to name it was so huge. So when you say, what do I think of when I think of shame? I think about that personal experience of recognition of shame and how even recognizing it and naming it was very freeing for me.
That's very much connected to a first step. And I just noticed that in your book title, you say, when you feel like you're never enough. And so shame and perfectionism seem to be intricately connected in some way because we are taught in the Bible of how God is holy and perfect and how we don't measure up and we're not enough and we're sinful. And yet in Jesus' teaching, Matthew 5:48, he gives us a command, be perfect as I am perfect. Oh
Mm.
my goodness, what
Hmm.
do we do with that?
Yeah. So, I think this is what was made it so hard in thinking about perfectionism is that for most types of perfectionism, right? Say you're struggling academically, as that is a big thing in certain Asian American cultures or Asian American immigrant culture in some
Hmm.
settings. That can be huge, like perfectionism in terms of academics, or maybe athletics in American culture, or whatever else it is. You can kind of tell people, well, it's not as important as you think it is, right? You can say it's okay if you don't get 100 or if you don't get an A, or parents can say that to kids, like it's okay if you don't get an A, I still love you. It doesn't really matter that much if you don't win this medal. But you can't say that to Christian to be like, well, it's okay if you're not holy. Like, it's okay if you just
Mm.
sin a little bit more, right? And for the Christian perfectionist, the difficulty is how do we reconcile, just like you said, what do we do with that? The fact that Jesus said, be holy and be perfect as my Heavenly Father is perfect, without this underlying sense of continual anxiety and guilt.
Mm.
And for me, that's been my wrestle, right? Where people have
Mhm.
told me, like, hey, just maybe you're just too hard on yourself. You just need to
Mm.
try a little bit less. But we're like, I can't lower that standard that Jesus put. And for me, where I found peace, and I think that the peace that God offers us is in relationship with Him. How does He treat us, even as we fail to meet these standards that are good and that He has called us to? He knows that we're not going to meet them. How does He deal with us as we fail? So that's the question for me that has been hard, but also been helpful to address.
And yeah, I know you take the entire book to address that, but I want to see if we can unpack that a bit so that our listeners can get untangled from
Mm,
what we do with Jesus' words while we're also feeling like times were not enough, when we don't get the 100 on the test, when we don't stick the landing and get the
hmm
10.0 on gymnastics. You mentioned sports also. And then there's times, even here when I record podcasts, when I say too many filler words or I
hmm
don't say the right phrase and I basically condemn myself and say, man, why did I do that? I wish I was more on top of things. And so
hmm
I kind of feel like it's a performance anxiety. Is that a right way to describe what's happening when we feel this wrestling with perfectionism?
I think there definitely is an aspect of performance and anxiety in it that
Mm.
it can manifest in. Definitely anxiety, and definitely I understand that post podcast listening to yourself. I didn't realize that I said this word that often, this filler, or I just wish I had said that, that one answer that I thought of right after I ended and said bye. So there definitely can be that aspect of anxiety and of performance in it. I think where maybe it is a little bit different for those who are struggling with perfectionism as it deals with Christian perfectionism is that it goes deeper than a performance. So even though you may perform well, you can still feel this underlying sense of guilt and
Mm.
regret and anxiety. Like maybe I did well on the surface, but the deepest question that we have is not so much how people see me, but how God sees my performance. And I know that God sees past my outward performance. So maybe I answered those questions well, or I didn't. If I didn't, then it's not even just, oh man, I look so stupid, but it's, oh man, like I wasn't faithful to God. I wasn't faithful to prepare like I
Mm,
should. I wasn't prayerful enough. I was too self-centered, so those kinds of commands that God kind of tells us about, like loving, being self-centered, not being self-centered, being faithful, but that kind of comes in constantly as this accusation instead of an encouragement and exhortation. And so that's where I think a lot of that anxiety, it's not even just how I appear to people, it's how we appear to God. And then thinking, well, I, even if I perform well, God knows my heart, and I know I wasn't exactly, you know, selfless in every single circumstance. So am I a complete failure before God because of that? So I think that's where there's like overlap and also a little bit of distinction.
yeah, and I've heard you say the phrase Christian perfectionism several times, and one of the things you point to is realizing that our relationship with God and how God sees us is very much important to untangle us from
Mm,
the need to measure up because we don't measure up, um, that we aren't perfect, but God still loves us and accepts us. In fact, theologically, and the good news of the gospel is God makes us perfect in Christ.
mm, hmm
And therefore, we don't have to worry about performing because the performing is already done at the cross.
hmm
Is that what you get into with the book?
I think we all have to start there for sure.
Mm,
And so that's
mhm,
that's where I begin, right? This this premise of Christianity is not feeling like is knowing and coming to that point where God opens our eyes to see, wow, like I am messed up, right? I'm a sinner. I can't change myself. And in my life, that's my story of
mm,
I had grown up hearing the gospel, but as I really started pursuing God personally, that was the first time I understood sin, not just in like a mental, I know I'm a sinner, everybody's a sinner kind of way, but like really, oh my goodness, this goes deep. Like this is deeper than just losing my temper at my sibling, or this is deeper than just being, lying on the outside. It's like, wow, it's like what I want, like I want glory, or I want
mm.
myself to be loved over other people, or just so it goes deep in there. And I think it is the work of the Holy Spirit that opens our eyes to that, so that we see, wow, we need God and we need Jesus, and He is the perfect one who is righteous, was right, like what you said, was righteous for us. And because of that, I stand righteous before a holy God. Like that is the foundation of any freedom and peace that we have. So we definitely have to start there, I think.
Yes. And then to actually make that a part of our daily life. So I'm going to just follow along with the journey that you went through, that you started with a blog post as you shared some of your own personal wrestling with perfectionism as a follower of Christ. And somehow that became a book. Describe what that experience was like. Did you get invited to write a book, or did you initiate looking for a place to publish a book and wrestle with maybe some of the feelings of will you measure up? Are you going to be enough? And how will
Hmm
this book be received?
Yeah, I joke around with people when they would be like, what are you writing about? And I tell them writing a book for people who are anxious and guilty in their relationship with God, writing a book for Christian perfectionists. Basically, I'm writing a book for myself. Like, like, and several times people have been like, when I'm sharing, friends like, you are writing a book about this very struggle that you're talking to me about. And even after it was published, I was talking about to one of my coworkers about how anxious I was about some podcasts that I was going to be on. And then he said, well, I did read this book on perfectionism. And in my head, I was thinking, what was this book that he read? And what is he going to say that's so helpful to me? And then, until I realized he was just joking. Like he's like, it's your book. And so this has definitely not been just a mental exercise for me or just some kind of theological undertaking, but was born out of struggle that I've had. Like you said, I wrote a blog post on it, I think back in 2016, about just how I've been finding help in the scriptures and in with God with this anxiety and with this guilt and kind of scrupulosity is what some people would also describe it as.
Mm, hmm
And because there were so many things out there that I found were unhelpful, like people would say, Christian perfectionist, you're just a sinner. You're just sinning by your perfectionism, and perfectionism is a sin. And
mm,
and I'm like, I kind of get it, but at the same time, it's just making me feel worse. And also it's just heaping onto my perfectionism. And so I was just like, I think there's something that's missing in this space, right? There has to be another answer besides, well, just stop trying so hard. Just, lower your standards, whatever, sin more. You're perfectly imperfect. Fine. And well, you're a sinner. Stop being perfectionist because that's selfish and you're just self-centered. And so when I wrote that post, I think again, it was this naming of this struggle and that people resonated with and reached out to me about. But it was many, many years later. Sorry, this is a long way to get to answering your question, but many, many years later, I just thought one day, maybe I'll just start writing these just list of scripture passages and ways that is helping me, or I want to meditate on it in light of the struggle. And from there, I made a goal just to write a few sample chapters, and reached out to a publisher, and they got back to me. And that was the beginning, maybe 2 years ago.
very cool. And when I think of perfectionism, it's like, and I've written a book, but I didn't go the traditional publishing route because my book is about next generation Asian American churches, which is a very niche
Mm,
audience. So I
hmm
wouldn't think a traditional publisher would be interested in that. So I just went the self-published route and
hmm
just pushed through. And then I had an editor work with me. And later on, when I read the final print, I still noticed typos.
hmm
I was like, ouch. That takes away at my perfectionism for sure. And um,
hmm
when I think about if I were to write a book proposal with a traditional publisher, perfectionism would seem to be me to be like the first publisher I go for would accept it, and I would never face rejection. That would
hmm
be perfectionism. So I was like, boy, this perfectionism is just around every turn of the corner. That everything I do, I have this subconscious measure of what's perfect. And anything short
hmm
of that just uh, hurts my ego, hurts my um, feeling like I'm being faithful. And why am I wrestling with this? But when I talk to other Christians, it seems like not many people wrestle with that. Is it an
Mm.
Asian thing or is it a personality thing? What's going on?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I wondered, I was like, is this an Asian thing? And the interesting thing is that my publishers and the people that I work with, they're not Asian. And when they first, received it, they were still able to be like, I think I definitely, even what I've heard from people is either like, this really describes me, or this is not me at all, but I know people
Mm,
who this describes. And
mm,
so I think that there is definitely like, or even studies show there's definitely ways that perfectionism shows up in Asian culture in different ways, or maybe Asian immigrant culture, specifically in America, in different ways. We think about academics. That's like probably one of the
mm,
first things we think about.
mm,
But that kind of pervades like other cultures and maybe in different ways, subtly different ways. But definitely my experience of it is I am Asian, right? I'm Chinese American. And so my experience of it in Christian culture is a subculture. It's
mm,
Chinese, Asian American, immigrant, evangelical American growing up in the 90s and 2000s subculture. And I do see how some ways that we maybe were taught about the gospel, or kind of thought about, oh, well, we're saved And then now we have to do all these things for Jesus. And that's like you're saved by the gospel, by grace alone. And I think a lot of us learn that really well. We wouldn't be
Hmm.
like, we would never say, I can gain heaven because I'm good or
Hmm.
because I do good things. But at the same time, we can think of this sacrifice that God has done for us, and actually it can, in a way, be twisted in our minds to make us feel extra guilty. Um, in a way that's kind of like, I know a lot of people may have heard, um, well, look at all that we gave up for you when we immigrated. And so
Hmm.
you better make the most of it. Like you better. And so that some of there's that anxiety, right? My parents gave up everything
Hmm.
for me. I need to do well to honor their sacrifice. But there's also an added, maybe I need to do well because I had to support them because of all that they gave up too. So
Hmm.
sacrifice gets tied in with guilt and shame. And I think that can translate into our Christianity sometimes too. For
Hmm.
some of us who grew up in that setting where it's okay, Jesus did all this stuff for me. And so when I fail, it doesn't actually, I'm not more grateful for his forgiveness. I actually feel even guiltier, like, oh, he did this for me, and I'm still like this, right? What is wrong with
Hmm.
me?
Hmm.
And so I do think there are ways that it plays out in Asian culture, maybe Chinese culture. I can't speak for all Asian cultures, Chinese American culture in specific ways in our spirituality.
Yeah, and I've been in certain church contexts where there's certain people that give, 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 and sacrifice, sacrifice, sacrifice to their own detriment of health,
Hmm.
and that's just overdoing it. That's not appropriating grace while um, staying healthy, and that's where I guess, well, it's not perfection per se, but just how easily it is for some people to distort our faith, our living out our
Hmm.
faith after we've been saved.
Hmm.
And when it comes to perfectionism, then what's one of the nuances that you really wanted to bring out through your
Hmm.
book? I mean, you
Hmm.
define it, you bring in a lot of great research, and we're going to mention some of the other interviews you've done where you dig into more books, but I just wanted to get one thing about this nuance that you really wrestled through.
One thing that I really felt strongly about in writing this book, and that's why actually it's bookended
Mm,
by chapters that have to do with this, is that
mm,
the desire for perfection is a good thing.
mm,
I think a lot of times our gut response right to this kind of perfectionism, either in because of what we experienced in our lives or because of the anxiety and the guilt that we're experiencing with the desire for perfection, is that we kind of think, well, we just feel like we need to push that desire away. But I really feel deeply that this desire, and I think theologically there is a case that this desire for perfection, desire to be the best version of ourselves that we can be before God, the desire to
mm,
be always loving, the desire to be perfect is because that was what we were made to be. We were meant
mm,
to be perfect, and we were meant to to always be making choices that would lead to everybody's flourishing, right? Some of this is where I think in the Asian context, it is very specifically comes out because my perfectionism isn't just about me, it's how my choices affect everybody else. So if I'm outside the will of God, then I'm anxious that then my church suffers because of me, my children suffer because of me,
mm,
because, we are interdependent in our culture. And so, but that's because we were always meant to be making choices before the fall, before sin entered the world that would lead to flourishing and more flourishing. And so I think that recognition that, oh yeah, the reason why I am lamenting and feeling so deeply disappointed and upset that I am not who a God made me to be is because there is this sense that I was supposed to be something different. But I also think it's good because the desire for perfection is good because it's actually also promised to us, right? God promises that one day we will be like him and we'll see him as he is, right? That we are not yet who we will be. And that promise of perfection is actually something that brings me great hope. Like, I think that this desire that I have for perfection actually makes me long for heaven more, not because, not just because, oh, I'm not going to struggle anymore. I mean, there is that part of that where, wow, I'm going to be free from the sinful nature. I'm going to be just able to completely worship God like I want to. But it also just is this great hope. Like, God promises that I'm going to get there, that in end of Jude, right? He will present you before his presence with blameless, with great joy, on that day. And so for the Christian perfectionists, those of us who struggle with that, I think we can experience in a different way that deep longing for heaven and for the new heavens, for the new earth. And that's a distinction and the nuance that I really wanted, instead of just kind of poo-pooing perfectionism or the perfect.
Mm. Well, so well said. That what an encouraging word and hopeful word. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for writing that. And I want to invite people to learn more about the book through the podcast, but also buy it for yourself and for your friends. So what are 2 or 3 podcast interviews that you've really enjoyed that we can add in the show notes and have people listen more to how you've addressed Christian perfectionism in your book?
A short one that I think I really enjoyed. I enjoyed speaking to Aaron Lee at the Sola Network.
Mhm.
That was a short and sweet. He had some really good questions that I got to answer, for a quick overview of what the book is and the heart of the book. And Aaron also was kind of been a cheerleader from the beginning, with for me, and so that was kind of a nice celebration. I felt like for us together, as a team, or it felt like a team effort to me. So that was one. And another one for those who are listening that are writers or creatives. I really enjoyed my conversation with Jonathan Rogers at the Habit podcast. So that's a
Okay.
podcast that's for those who are for writers. And I just enjoyed it because, as an Asian American Christian writer, I didn't really have that many people to look to in my writing journey.
Mm,
And the Habit podcast kind of really gave me uh a vision of what writing might look like in my life. It was kind of like my company along the way. And so to be able to be on it is a huge honor. And I really enjoyed being able to talk about writing. And I really want to encourage those who are listening, and especially as we deal with shame in Asian American culture, they could feel like I don't have anything to say. Like, what do I have to give? Why does my
mm,
voice matter?
mm,
Or, other people can say it better than me. There's just this kind of self-doubt maybe sometimes in our culture, because it seems like it's prideful to even say I have something that somebody else should listen to. You should read it, or you can. But I think, yeah, I really want to encourage, or I've been encouraged by the community around me and by different people, that others can be helped by your story. And I know that's what you're doing here and in podcasting. And if you're interested in doing that via writing, that would be a great podcast. Not just my episode, but the whole podcast.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so we'll add links in the show notes at erasingshame.com. Encourage you to check those out. And for those that want to connect with you, Faith, how can they do that?
I have a Substack, so faithchang.substack.com. That would be
Mhm.
probably the best place to start. And from there, you might be able to find where I am social media wise sometimes.
Fantastic. Great chatting with you, Faith. Really appreciate your effort in giving voice to us as writers, as Asian American Christians, as Christians who struggle with perfectionism, and to realize it is a hopeful vision for how God is making us the best version of ourselves. God's blessing to you. Thank you, Faith.
You too. Thank you so much, DJ.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the Erasing Shame podcast. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Erasing Shame podcast. Get this episode's show notes at our website, erasingshame.com. Subscribe to the Erasing Shame podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or any podcast app. And please add a rating and review so that we can reach more people with our message of hope and healing.